this is my thought process in piecing together today. I have a master's degree in art history. However, that was 20 years ago, and I'm just fearful that all this information that I learned is going to get rusty. So I pieced together a lot of information. I'm going to start at the medieval time, and I'm going to move sort of chronologically. We're going to start with medieval art, which is visible here. This is what they call Byzantine art, because the Roman Empire was split into two sections, and one fell very early, the other one fell in, I think, 1453, and that was the Eastern Roman Empire, which was what they call the Byzantine era, or Turkey and Greece. And this art is very flat, it's very gold, they use a lot of gold leaf. The expressions are kind of difficult to read, although there is an eye contact between Mary and Jesus. And the babies in this time period don't look very realistic. They call it like the ugly baby period, because babies are painted as if they're adults. So this baby has a receding hairline and eyes that are not very large and wide like most children have. So this is very indicative of this particular medieval time period. I'm talking now before the 1400s. So also what Mary is wearing, I'm gonna bring that up several times. She's cloaked in blue. We're gonna talk about why she's in blue and why is that significant. And the halos around her, they're gonna start to disappear during the Renaissance. Okay. That's funny. Oh my gosh, this thing. I'm wondering why it's not working now. Okay. Well, I'll just keep it here then. So we have on the left, very flat, very religious. The colors are bright. The figure does not look realistic. This is a religious story of the Jesus transforming the Sea of Galilee and feeding with loaves and fishes. And what you're seeing here is going to transform very quickly, as you can see in the Raphael School of Athens. And this is a very famous painting, and what this represents is a transformation where artists are becoming more well-known. They're signing their work. They're not considered craftsmen anymore. In the medieval times, they were considered almost like a plumber or a skilled worker. And you're seeing a shift to realistic bodies underneath the robes. They're to the left, these are philosophers. To the right, they're scientists. We have Aristotle, Plato, and this is Socrates. And the significance of that is that we're not talking about religion anymore. Now we're talking about ancient philosophy. So the Renaissance was a period of time of rebirth, and there was a big emphasis or a big rebirth or renaissance in the thinking of the people. There was a lot of humanistic individualism that is taking flight now. And so with that, people are still respectful of religion. However, they're taking their God-given talents like art, and they're glorifying God through their artwork, but not necessarily drawing a religious scene. And Plato is pointing towards the sky, talking about our celestial beings, astronomy. Plato is pointing sort of to the ground, our landscape in which that we live in on Earth, and here Socrates, which is both their master, is kind of taking a tally of how many arguments the two men get into. And in the foreground, you see this figure right here is actually Michelangelo. Michelangelo is a brooding dark figure, sort of moody, and sitting with his arm on a marble piece. indicating that Raphael, who was alive at the same time that Michelangelo was sculpting in Florence, they were friendly towards each other, and Michelangelo made his sort of his friend, and he gets a little cameo here. And you'll see there's more of a push towards architectural artistry, and there's more outdoor scenes, and maybe not so much indoor. I'm gonna just pull up my notes. Okay, just before I switch the slide, I want to talk to you a little bit about medieval Europe. Of course, there was the Black Plague, the Crusades, the fall of the Roman Empire, and much of their life in medieval Europe was spent outside. They were simple dressed, they were living on a meager diet. Medieval villages consisted of a population comprised mostly of farmers, and most of the time they spent working the land. Why this is significant is life is going to change, and the middle class will be on the rise. Middle class is rising because there's an increase in trade, and people have more time on their hands. So when they have more time and money on their hands, they become more interested in hobbies. And so you're going to see that there's a big shift in the actual culture. Life was very smelly, brutish. People were often in poverty. Ignorance was very prevalent. Very few people learned how to read and write in the medieval time. What I use as an example is stained glass windows, because throughout Europe you'll see that the churches use stained glass windows. Often people are confused about why that is. They were more expensive than regular glass. Well, it was really a way to spread Christianity, almost like a comic book. They're showing you the life of Jesus and the Stations of the Cross in a church, so that the masses, when they come, they can illustrate their point through the stained glass. And the contrast that with the Renaissance, where humans are no longer scrawny, puny sinners. They're glorifying God with their talent. There's a perfect balance between motion and rest. Characteristics of the Renaissance: use of perspective, which is going towards the vanishing point. Light and shadow, proportion. Colors are rich, warm, and glowing. Oftentimes, there is no light source, certainly not a natural light source. So sometimes the figures are illuminated themselves, and you'll see how the artists tackle that. There's use of classical topics and stories and myths depicted in their painting. Lots of symmetry, as we saw in the School of Athens. Music was a representation of, this is Leonardo da Vinci's words, the invisible things, which I thought was interesting. It's a sister of painting. So if you think about some of the invisible, like our nonverbal communication or our emotions, you're going to see that really represented both in music and in art. The figures drawn from nature based on observation of the real world. And we'll see that when we talk about the master artisans getting permission, sometimes not permission, to dissect dead bodies in the morgue, the unclaimed bodies. They dissect for the advancement of their own knowledge of the human anatomy. And anatomically correct visual emotions. And then I just wanted to remind you that here, as far as like literature, this is the age of William Shakespeare. So I'm going to give you that to look at. The consequence or the result of the Crusades, which were several wars fought from Christians against the Islamic Muslim world, was the positive outcome was that Europeans were in contact with new cultures, new thought beliefs, and encouraged ship voyages. So when I think of this time period, I think getting ready for Christopher Columbus, right? Getting ready for Captain Cook in the 1700s. They kind of encouraged these massive voyages. Mongolian Empire, responsible for opening the Silk Road to the east, which is Asia. So tea, fabrics such as silk become more infused in the European society, spices. Feudalism declines, and there's this rise of the middle class. The Ottoman Turkish Empire fell, as we talked about, and with the consequence of that was or the result of that was there was a lot of Greek philosophers and artists that spread their way through Europe, and they migrated. And then the printing press was invented in 1455. And the significance of the Gutenberg printing press was that Bibles and literature were no longer expected to be hand created by scribes. They were allowed to be mechanized now. So that allowed for knowledge and literacy to spread. It was an exciting time. Here's the map of the city-states. We've talked in here about where people have traveled. Try to think about all of these as separate. And we talked a little bit about dialects. All of these would have separate dialects. So when I talk about Leonardo da Vinci, who was born in Florence, traveling and eventually living in Milan, it might not seem like a significant move, but really it was like moving to another country, because the dialects were different, the everyday life were different, even the fashion. He was known for wearing these long tunics, similar to what I'm wearing, but with leggings, and having a beard and long hair. He had long curly hair. When he was young, it was blonde, and he was a very good-looking man. He was a musician. He played the lute, and when he was brought to Milan to work under the Duke there, he sort of stood out because he had sort of fashions from a different place. So the Renaissance birthplace is in Florence. I want you to think of the Medici family. They were very powerful bankers. And some of the Medici family actually became popes. And these popes used the Catholic money to hire these master artists they commissioned these artists to paint or sculpt sometimes their chapel, their inside of their domes, and you'll see that as we move on in the slideshow. The Pazzi Chapel on the next page is a good example of that. So in Florence, this is where the birthplace is, and then we sort of move to Milan, and Leonardo da Vinci gets a position there under the Duke, and Milan, that's where the Last Supper was painted, and that's where Jesus and his disciples are. That was painted in a fresco style in a monastery. And fresco style means wet plaster. You have to work really fast, and it's not very forgiving. It also doesn't last very long. So in that particular monastery, there's been a lot of work done to restore that Last Supper. Italian artists studied Roman coins from ancient Rome. They studied metals. The word I'm saying is medals, metals, meaning they studied the past. They studied ancient Rome. They were very interested in ancient Greek and it was like a neoclassical society. Portraits were head and shoulders shown in profile. Truest representation of the model, as I say, warts and all. High foreheads, long noses, small chin, fine eyes, blonde hair, in elaborate styles. They would say it's in Espanola style. Some of the portraits, one in particular, that lady in ermine, a lady with an ermine, if you know Leonardo da Vinci's, it's all in a braid back here, and that's in España style. So the mid-Renaissance portraits, they sort of changed, so where it's not true profile anymore, it's more, and this is really specific to Milan and Leonardo da Vinci during this time, he did like a 3/4 view. So now you're seeing really just this. And then it sort of changes to Venice, probably because of where Venice is. It's a trade port, and it really blows up and becomes very, very popular. These are independent states. The only one that is ruled under the Catholic Church is Rome. And so I'm talking now about the city-state. This is a trading hub. I'm talking about Venice. It's a powerful place of commerce. And the colors are very red, blue. The brushstroke is visible. What's interesting about Venice is some of the artwork is very hard edge. That's what I mean by linear. There's like a rocky outline, almost geometric. So we're going to take a deep dive. Okay, talking about the Renaissance philosophies before we dive into the artwork. Classicism is the renewal of the classical ideals and classical philosophies. and there's a sort of a rise of skepticism. Now, it's not anti-religion. When I say skepticism, I don't mean atheism. What I mean is more like think for yourself, logic and truth. The Greco-Roman influences, especially the three graces, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Those are the three daughters of Zeus. Secularism, the life should be lived well on this earth, on this plane, and not focus on an afterlife. Humanism is where people have certain rights just because they're human. And individualism, which was very different in medieval times, where you needed your society and your community to thrive. This is actually a very American ideal. The one person is more important than the group. Not every society feels that way. America for sure. And so that gets back to skepticism, which is think for yourself. Have a good time on this planet. Don't worry so much about struggling in this life and having a great afterlife. It's all about here and now. And then symmetry and balance and proportion. Okay, we're gonna dive into a Botticelli. Sandro Botticelli, this is the Primavera, which in Italian means springtime. If you have pasta primavera in an Italian restaurant, that means, which I often have, I enjoy that. And what it is, it's pasta with vegetables, and those are the springtime vegetables. Like you'll have broccoli, zucchini, peppers. So that's one way to remember this is called Primavera. In the middle here, you'll see Venus, the goddess of love, and Cupid, who actually has two arrows, one for love and one to turn you off, one for disgust, believe it or not. And these are the three graces. The three graces are joy, elegance, and bloom. And they're a gift to humanity. As I said, they're Zeus's daughters, and they're a gift to humanity. They're in mythology, artists could get away with this nudity. They couldn't really do nudity before the Renaissance. It was considered vulgar. And even in the early Renaissance, you were not allowed to look at, draw, paint, depict the human body. You were allowed to skirt around it if you did a mythological figure. And this woman here is running. She actually is running from this man. In the next scene, you're going to see that it's like a Zephyr, it's called. And he's up to no good. He loves her and he wants her and he's going to take her. But what's happening is she's clinging on to the figure of Flora. And I wish this is more clear, I apologize. She has flowers on her dress. And she's clinging on to her and she's actually trying to become her. There's flowers coming out of her mouth. She's being transformed. It's a curse from her father. I believe this is Daphne, and she's rejecting this other god. And so with that rejection, her own father curses her and turns her into a tree. So this is why she's clinging onto Flora and she's morphing, she's changing because she's running away. The figures are illuminated. Now this is different than what I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, which is darker in the front, lighter in the back. This is lighter in the foreground, darker in the midground, and then lighter in the back. So you have three planes here. And in the foreground, these figures are illuminated, but not by natural light, from within. Grazie or gracias is from the root word, comes from the three graces, and it's an ancient practice of building these statues of the three graces near a spring as a way to give back to nature. So they would build these statues in some sort of an area where there's a spring, where there's water, and that would echo against maybe the rock and the water, and that echo is your gift to humanity. And so I thought that was an interesting tie-in, that thank you, grazie or gracias, is tied back to the three graces. Okay, speaking a little bit about architecture, which is not my forte, but this is the Pazzi Chapel in Florence. It was designed by a man named Brunelleschi, and he saw how the Romans solved the problem of how to build a dome. So bricks, as they come together towards the top of a dome, it's very, very heavy, right? So how do you get that to release, to stand up when you release all the scaffolding. One of the ideas, which is kind of interesting, is to hide Florentine, which is the money, the florins, in the dirt and fill this area with dirt, and you would spill florins in there. And the reason is once the scaffolding, or in this case, the idea was once the dirt reaches the top and builders are allowed to build, then to get that dirt removed, you could get the everyday people from your community who would be thirsty for the florins to help shovel out the dirt. So that was just an interesting idea that somebody had to solve the problem. So this problem was solved by Brunelleschi, and he created this top of the Pazzi Chapel. And this is the representation of the Pazzi family's wealth and generosity, but also their piety and their status. So what we're going to talk about today is a lot of people showing off their status and the artists working for patrons that are very interested in you knowing how powerful they are and how rich they are. The architecture is a medieval cross replaced with a Greek cross. So the medieval cross looked like the cross that you're familiar with now, with the long vertical line and the short horizontal one, like this. But now we're moving towards the Greek cross, which is just a plus sign. So I'm talking about if you look at the blueprints, if you were to look at the architecture, this chapel actually goes back, and then there's arms, there's wings here. So if you were to look from above, it actually looks like a cross. And it's equal arms contained in a circle, symbolizing the perfection of God. And I took this image. It's because you'll see the theme I bring up is the problem that they're trying to solve is how to square the human body, how to put a circle within a square. You might know Leonardo da Vinci's famous Vitruvian Man, where he's like this. And so this is just a good example of how architecture also changes. And even within the door frame, you can see that there's this dome, this semicircle. There's 3 columns, and 3 columns, there's a lot of symmetry. Okay, getting back to Botticelli, who's the artist that I showed you on slide 8. This is called the birth of Venus. So Venus is in the middle. She is born of the Sea of Galilee. This is Flora, who's going to clothe her. This is the Zephyr that is flying in, symbolizing bringing in the new season. And she's born of a clamshell. That's the myth. Venus emerged, from the Sea of Cyprus, and Venus is the god for beauty and inspiring love. Notice the contrapposta. So if I can draw on this, I'm going to show you something called contrapposta. And that means the way that she's standing, I want you to notice that the weight is on that one leg. The other one, she could probably lift it up. And the reason that's important is because during this time period, artists are starting to sculpt, and they need to have something that is attached. It's called a sprue, something that is attached to the base of the marble piece. In other words, having just 2 feet is not going to stand up. Think of a mannequin. Even mannequins in store need some sort of a base. And so they do this contrapposta on purpose, where the S shape shows you that the shoulders, the hips, and the leg are all balancing the human form. And so this becomes very popular. Figures in action. Everyday people like us witnessing a miracle. Everyday people witnessing an event. There's a breakaway from halos and Madonna in the center of the painting, of the composition. There's popular ideas from Socrates and Plato, increased trade, landscapes, which was never a subject matter, start to become more important. Think of the Mona Lisa. Behind her, there's a landscape. In fact, it's an artificial landscape. It's a made-up one. Leonardo da Vinci did not paint that from life. He painted Mona Lisa from life, but the background is not a real place. So that's kind of an interesting thing. That becomes more popular. a panoramic, softened, blurred edges, crowd scenes that are witnessing a miracle. And sometimes we're the crowd. We're witnessing the miracle. Okay, this is a graphic design from a man named Maurice Ticelli, who gave me permission to use this. And I wanted to talk a little bit about Raphael. So Botticelli was a normal man, no big scoop on him. But Raphael lived a charmed life. And Raphael was an architect and a painter, and he was very well liked. He had no struggle or trouble getting jobs. As I said, he worked down the wing from Michelangelo, and he became friendly with him. He did die at the age of 37. Some people say it was an STD, or maybe he had some sort of a heart trouble during a sexual act, but he was definitely prolific in his time period as far as art, and it was sad that he died so young. But he was part of the group, very, very popular, even during his time period. So Raphael painted the School of Athens, which I want to give you a minute to kind of read. Can you read it? Is it too small, the text? Well, I'm going to send you this, so if you have any interest in going back and reading it. But as I said, Michelangelo's here, Plato and Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and he puts himself in the portrait too. Okay. I mentioned it before that Leonardo da Vinci was interested in the anatomy so much that he received permission to dissect the unclaimed bodies, and for the purpose of learning, for the purpose of drawing. My husband recently had some heart trouble, and I was reading something about, believe it or not, bypass surgery. Can't believe it's come to that. He's only 46, but one of the things I was reading about with regards to my husband and the heart was that Leonardo da Vinci was one of the first people ever to indicate that there's buildup or plaque within the arteries, which I thought was really interesting. Let me tell you a little bit about him, because he did paint. So he painted these two that flank the one on the inside, and this is another Raphael. Michelangelo was born from a relationship between a poor maid, a woman, and a man that was out of her league at another social level, and they never married. So because he was born out of wedlock, he was not able to go to school, which was probably the best thing, because if he was to go to school, he might have been expected to follow his father's path and become a notary, which is like a clerk, for the town. And he never would have had the patience. If Leonardo da Vinci was born in this day, he probably would have been on the spectrum. He definitely was socially awkward. He was a homosexual, just painting a picture for you. And he was a procrastinator. It took him a very long time to complete paintings or art or commissions. So now that you know a little bit more about Leonardo, I'm going to talk to you about, so his artwork he was very interested in the human figure, and he has hundreds of sketchbooks that show his interest in human dissection and even animal dissection. Bill Gates owns several of his sketchbooks, which is interesting. And Bill Gates doesn't just put it away for his own purpose. He allows these sketchbooks, they're called codexes, C-O-D-E-X. He allows them to travel around the world for display. I waited online for hours in New York once to see it. And I didn't want to wait online anymore, but if I got out of line, then I would never get it back in line, right? So I just stayed online. But I mean, you could look it up online. You don't need to do that. You can you can look online to see them. There's this, so that's Leonardo. And I'm moving on to this pyramid composition. This is Mary in blue, Jesus, there is a small halo, and this is John the Baptist, who was always said to have been in the wilderness. They are related. Mary has a cousin named Elizabeth, and Elizabeth's son is John the Baptist. And John the Baptist's purpose was to baptize people, convert him. convert them. He was said to have worn the cloak of a camel, which doesn't make too much sense. But some of these clues that artists put in to artwork are really for us to understand who's in it. So I know a lot about religion, and I'm not a woman of faith. But I know a lot because of the clues that artists have left me. For instance, this crucifix right here, or this, I should say this cross, is going to foreshadow Jesus' death on the cross, the crucifixion. So this is a foreshadowing. These two are cousins, and Mary is caring for them. You're going to see that Mary is in the center in this particular piece, but there's also this landscape, this depth that this artist is trying to create. And you're going to see it's dark up front, or I should say saturated up front, and as you go back, cool colors. When I say cool colors, I mean blues and greens, hazy, subtle, and in the back. Now, Leonardo da Vinci painted the Mona Lisa. It was a commission piece. Her name was Lisa del Giocondo, and her husband was a wealthy merchant, and she sat for him. She had three sons of her own. She was a young woman, and he loved this portrait. He didn't love her, just to be clear, because when I teach kids, they often think that he had a crush on her. He loved this portrait so much. There's two of them. One is in Spain. It's a little bit more saturated. It's a little bit brighter, and it's identical. She's wearing a veil, typical of women of those days. She did once have eyebrows, but through a restoration process, they were removed. Some people think that was the style of the time. That is not true. The clothes were the style of the time, this drapery, and she's actually on a balcony. And they do believe that there's some evidence that perhaps it's not a chair like people think, that there was more to this painting. In the background, this landscape scene that he created, no one completely knows where that is. What's interesting with this particular Mona Lisa is that he never let it go. He never gave it to Lisa's husband. And no one really knows why, other than he fell in love with it's kind of like a resume. When you fall in love, especially with an artist, we have a portfolio. When you fall in love, in those times you can't replicate it. So he brings it around with him to get future jobs. So he kind of stiffed them. He never did give her the portrait. And what's particularly interesting about Mona Lisa is it's not very large. It's even smaller than this in real life. It is in the Louvre now, and you might be wondering, why is it in the Louvre? Why is it in France when he was Italian and spent most of his life in Italy? Well, you'd be right to say that. The reason why it's in France is because when Leonardo was older, maybe in his 60s, the King of France asked Leonardo to move in with him in his chateau in France. And Leonardo did make that move, which was a little surprising because you know about history, and I'm not a history buff, but I know it from art. France invaded Rome, and so there was rape, there was kidnapping. So it's a little surprising that within the span of his life, he had this change of heart and decided to move to France, learn French. He struggled with language. Of course, he spoke Italian. He struggled. There's evidence that he struggled with Greek and with Latin. And so Leonardo wasn't dumb. He was raised outside, you might say homeschooled. He lived with his father. I told you a little bit about his past. His mother was a maid. His father took him to raise him, married a young woman. That woman died. Married another woman. That woman died in childbirth. So Leonardo is around all of these young women, not too much older than him, that he's supposed to respect as a stepmother. And he's not allowed to go to school. So he's kind of a fish out of water. Come to, the end of the story there is that Leonardo's father winds up having many, many children. Of course, after Leonardo dies, they all want their fourth in their inheritance, right? Isn't that always the way? But as a young man, he spent a lot of time in nature and learning about science. He was a genius. He was an engineer. He has sketches in his notebooks or codexes, sketches of things like the helicopter. I mean, I'm talking in the 1500s, way before we were ever going to build a helicopter. He had the idea of a vehicle with a propeller. He was very fascinated with the idea of humans taking flight. So he did a lot of sketches and experiments with humans that had wings attached. He dissected many animals that flew, really obsessed with birds, obsessed with bats. Now, he was also, interestingly, he was an animal rights activist. He would go to the market and purchase birds that were caged and let them free. And they would say, Leonardo, you're crazy. And he would say, his direct quote is, I will not let my body become a graveyard for animals. And so he was into healthy living before it was a thing. And some people attribute that to perhaps why he lived so long. And the Mona Lisa really wasn't that famous until the early 1900s when, believe it or not, it was housed at the Louvre Museum in France and was stolen by a worker. And that worker put it into their coffee table, like literally put the Mona Lisa into a coffee table until he was eventually caught. And believe it or not, I say that because, do you know who was questioned for that theft? Pablo Picasso, who was a Spanish artist who lived most of his adult life in France. He was in France at the time, and he was questioned for the theft. It turned out to be a worker who went in on like a French national holiday when the museum was closed, but he had access, and stole the painting right off the wall. I mean, this is like I'm probably talking 1902, so, or maybe like 1910. And now, since subsequently, the Mona Lisa has been like this pop cultural phenomenon. It's been a victim of violence. It's been a victim of theft. It's been a victim of canned soup. I don't know if you follow the news in Europe, but these environmental activists are splashing soup on the Mona Lisa. Somebody just splashed cake on her. She's under bulletproof glass, this poor lady. They don't want her to live, to exist. And the reason these environmental activists are doing this extreme vandalism is because they say, why is Mona Lisa on the news tonight? It is on the news because of what we did. In other words, why are you so focused on this? You should be focused on oil. You should be focused on climate change. You know, these young activists that are very alarming. They're very alarming climate activists. And they want this to be on the news, which of course it does, so they succeed. They do get arrested, but soon let out of jail. And it's just like these horrific, situations that poor Mona Lisa has been through. One thing I will say is that when Leonardo did die in France, as I said, with the king in his room, there is a famous painting. It was painted 100 years later, but it's based on notes. And it's the king of France hanging over Leonardo. And the thought was that if he was such a genius, that maybe on his last exhale, that I can breathe in some of that genius, Like now we wouldn't really do that. If someone's dying, we would give them their space and it could be contagious, whatnot. But he was just right up on him. And then everything in the room was willed. And Leonardo did have a young lover named Salve, which is like Italian for the devil. It was sort of a joke that this young man that accompanied Leonardo to France caused a lot of trouble. He didn't really listen to rules. So Salve did receive some of Leonardo's items, and the king housed this. I don't think the Louvre was built then, at least not the modern part of it, but the king housed this in France, and it will never leave. Oh, it was also stolen during World War II. It was put in a salt mine, if you've ever seen Monument Men. I mean, people really have it out for that Mona Lisa. So that's a story for another day. There's 3 types of arts mediums that were used. I talked about fresco being on the wet plaster. Egg tempera was becoming more popular. It literally is the yolk of an egg mixed with pigment. Now, think of the 1500s. In those days, you had to grind your own, and you most likely had an apprentice do it for you. And then that was good, but not great. Of course, it went sour. If you ever go to an art room and you smell paint that isn't smelling right, that's most likely tempera paint. It turns because it's made out of egg. But then oil paint became very popular. And this allowed artists, if you know about oil paint, this allowed artists to leave the the top of the painting for several days, sometimes several weeks, and then come back and rework it. It wasn't set in stone like it would be in the top two. Also, egg tempera is very matte. It has no sheen at all. Whereas oil paint, you can add some additional oils to add as like a binder or to make it more liquidy. This is a stone called lapis lazuli, and it is from Afghanistan. It's very expensive. That's why it wasn't used that much. And that's why the religious figures, like, it was reserved only for the most important figures. And that's why Mary wears blue, because Mary deserves the lapis lazuli. She's getting this paint and nobody else. This is called the Annunciation, and it's the angel Gabriel, who I think is a eunuch. I don't think this angel has a gender. Is telling Mary at 14 that she's with child. She's accepting the news, and you can see she's chosen. This is the dove indicating the Holy Spirit. Artists painting architecture, painting space, perspective. The vanishing point is back there. You can see the line. And this is the Garden of Eden, the expulsion, when after Eve is said to have eaten the pomegranate or apple, she then felt shame. Before that, she was nude, and Adam also. So the expulsion is when they were asked to leave the Garden of Eden after they ate the apple and disobeyed God. They now feel shame, and they're leaving the garden. It is said that God was so angry with Eve that he forever cursed her with menstrual cramps. He forever cursed her because she fell victim to the snake, that she will forever on a monthly basis feel pain. That was her punishment. We talked about the Medici family, specifically in Florence, and Lorenzo was a big name. I'm not really gonna spend a lot of time on this, but just note that some of the family actually were popes, so they were in charge of a large amount of money. And this is from Maurice Torcello, the graphic designer. I put that in the slide. Here's an example of Leonardo's, some of his sketches. Something interesting happened. There was a Dominican friar by the name of Savignello, and he was very disappointed and angry with the Catholic Church. So he gathered what he called sins and vices, and he put them all in a bonfire. And he even burned some very high quality masterpieces that were painted by people like Botticelli, who I showed you, the Primavera. He put in cologne, incense. At the time, believe it or not, they had condoms. He put in any books that he felt, it was like a book burning. He felt like he wanted to burn anything that was sinful. Objects like, and I have my notes here, mirrors, believe it or not, mirrors, cosmetics, fine dresses, immoral books, any objects that were destroyed, and even classical mythological subjects. Well, Savignello, eventually, it kind of catches up to him. He's too extreme, and he's actually killed, and I think he was beheaded in the town square. So that's called Bonfire of the Vanities. We're moving now towards the High Renaissance, and this is lively, dramatic, biblical events, adding of windows, landscapes by themselves that were not considered proper subject matter in the past, atmospheric perspectives, greens in the foreground, to create that illusion of depth. And just a little side note there on the bottom, that religious paintings that were large were typically painted for a church. Smaller ones were for wealthy patrons, painted for their homes. We talked a little bit about Mona Lisa. Back here, in Italian, this is called sfumato, and it means smoky effects. And so he's really nailing that sfumato. And atmospheric perspective, which is darker in the front, lighter in the back. And here's another slide to indicate that. Okay, I'm going to shift to Michelangelo, and I'm almost done, if you can bear with me. Michelangelo lived a very long time. He was just a beast of a man. He had hardly any interpersonal relationships, meaning that we don't know if he was homosexual or heterosexual. It really doesn't matter, but he never had any relations. Some people say that he didn't like touch. Or perhaps there was a lot of STDs floating around and he was really careful. We don't know. But we do know that he was moody. We do know that he drank a lot. And he seemed to have preferred the figure of the man. When you analyze the figure of the women, in the words of Leonardo, because Leonardo and Michelangelo did not get together, did not get along. So in the words of Leonardo, he said that the women looked like a sack of potatoes, meaning that they were very lumpy where they're supposed to have breasts, I guess. In other words, Michelangelo really didn't study the female anatomy. This is David, which he took on this neglected piece of marble that was very rectangular, and he took it from the quarry, and at the age of, I think, 27, he carved this marble sculpture of David, and he was raised, so Michelangelo was raised with his family, but he was taken on by the Medici family. They really kind of adopted him, so he was raised with money and power. And he was an apprentice to a man that was a sculptor. So he really was a sculptor first. He was kind of sucked into doing all this painting. This was his love. David, as you might know from the Bible, is a shepherd that volunteered to fight the giant Goliath. And what he has in his hand is the slingshot that he's going to kill Goliath with. He's supposed to be about 14 or 15 years old. He has a furrowed brow. And why is he in the nude? Because Michelangelo wanted you to see all of his muscles, his brute strength, his ability, and without being veiled in clothes. So David was this young man who's supposed to have sort of a prepubescent body, but he is quite muscular when you see him. And that David is in Florence. There's two of them. The real one is inside, as you can imagine. The replica is outside and it's larger. David is 17 feet tall, and when you stand underneath him, it looks very anatomically correct and proportional. However, his hand is very, very large when you look directly at him. And so I didn't know if there was going to be any children, so I didn't want to do like the full nude, but in this today. But you'll see that hands are large, and the artist did that for a reason. It's called forced perspective, so that when we look up, it looks correct. But when you look straight at, it looks distorted. This is the Pieta. This is in Rome. So these artists sort of danced around all the city centers for wherever their work was, really. And he was only 24 in the year 1500. Pieta is Italian for pity, and it's Mary and her 33-year-old son dead in her arms. This is the turning point where artists start to write their name on sculpture or paintings. Funny story, the day of the opening of this, there was a crowd of people, and Michelangelo snuck in the back to kind of see what people were talking about. Well, these people started to attribute this Pieta to somebody else, and he was really angry. So true story, he snuck in that night by candlelight, with a chisel, and chiseled in the sash that Mary wears. He chiseled Michelangelo Bonatti sculpted this in the year 1500, just in case you had any doubt. So that's kind of funny. And then the Sistine Chapel, which he was asked to do at the age of, so this was at the age of 24, and this was at the age of 26. So he was young, and he was asked to paint this gigantic ceiling. I'm going to explain this ceiling to you. In the middle is the story of Genesis, which is the first book of the Bible. And then on the sides, these are the prophets. In between the triangle, I'm pointing, these are the prophets, and these are our ancestors. Okay, so it's Genesis, the prophets, and the ancestors. And he painted this almost completely by himself on scaffolding. It must have been extremely painful. It took 4 years to complete. This is in Rome. this is where the Pope, it's called the Sistine Chapel, and this is where the popes are voted in by the cardinals. There's a movie now called Conclave, if you're interested in kind of seeing where they are housed. It's right here, and they have this interesting furnace that blows out black or white ash when they have the name of the new pope, when it's come to agreement. I think black means that they have not, and I think white means that they have come to a decision for a new pope. So here is God reaching out to Adam. I know I'm pressed for time. There are some theories that Michelangelo's sack or sphere, sorry, I said Michelangelo, I meant God, that we are in the image of God, and that God is flying in on this sack with cherubs, or putti in Italian, these little innocent babies. And some people have said that this is really Michelangelo showing us that God is reaching out for humanity when mankind is sort of apathetic about any relationship with him. Again, I'm not a woman of faith, but I know about it. And some people have said that this looks a lot like the brainstem. And Michelangelo was another person who dissected many bodies. So, in other words, don't be offended, but is God in our minds? Did we create God? Did God create us? He wants us to think. And another thing, I didn't know this until I did research for this slideshow, and I've heard of this before. This has been floating around for about a decade or so. But this I never heard of before, which is these are slices of the human brain that you can also see are kind of mimicked. This is called the Last Judgment. And yeah, I mean, I don't know if you believe in all that, but it is certainly interesting. And then 26 years later, he finishes the ceiling and he paints this side right here, the back wall. That's called the Last Judgment. So he does this in his early 20s. He does this in his 40s. And this is where they have this conclave of cardinals where they vote in for the Pope. Okay, I'm almost done. I just want to talk to you a little bit about the late Renaissance, the twisting of the body, the exaggerated stylization, art for art's sake, finally. Artists being acknowledged, being compensated fairly, high level of technical competence, and then contrapposto with the hips and legs in one direction and the chest in another. I think the best example is Michelangelo, kind of that twisting. Here's two examples, and believe it or not, the Statue of Liberty, her foot is up, so she's on the base, underneath the robes, that has to support this, and of course it's empty, that you could go up in the Statue of Liberty, so it's hollow inside. So to have that strength for her to stay, they need a contrapposto. And oh, the heresy. I end with Copernicus, who comes to the realization that we are a heliocentric world, meaning that the Earth travels around the sun, not the other way around. The Catholic Church is hugely offended, and they don't publish his work. No, he waits 30 years to publish his work. And then once it's published, the Catholic Church bans it from being published for 200 years. But I guess scientists will talk, and a man named Galileo proves him right. And this is just a funny graphic I got online. The sun, not Earth, the center. It all makes sense now. Every calculation confirms it. This will change everything. May this work illuminate the path to a new understanding of our cosmos. Basically, he's saying that we are one of many planets that circulate around the sun, and it just kind of goes against, I guess, people's idea of how the creation, how we came about, and it was considered heresy. Nicholas Copernicus, Mike, I'm not really one that's into quotes, but this is funny, and I'll end with that. To know that we know what we know, and to know that we do not know what we do not know, that is true knowledge. I thought that was funny. That's very Michelle. That's something I would say. So anyway, thank you for your time, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you. You're welcome.